She thought the call was a scam. Lily was 24 and her life was small in the best way. A steady shift at the coffee shop. Regulars who said her name like it mattered. A clean little apartment above a quiet street. Nothing glamorous, but it was safe. And after losing her mom, safe was the closest thing to peace. So when an unknown number lit up her phone on a slow afternoon, she almost let it ring out. "Hello?" A man's voice answered, careful and professional. "Am I speaking?" To Lily. Lily, daughter of Mary Smith. The cup in her hand slipped slightly. She steadied it against the counter. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Mr. Halbrook. I'm an attorney. I'm calling regarding Mr. Robert Sterling." The name meant nothing. Lily's brow furrowed. "He has asked me to contact you," the lawyer continued. "He believes, and we have proof, that he is your father." For a moment, the cafe sounds fell away. The espresso machine hissed. A chair scraped. A regular laughed near the window. But Lily heard none of it. All she could hear was the word father. Like a door in her life had been yanked open. "My mother never told me," she managed. "I understand," the lawyer said. "Mr. Sterling would like to meet you in the city. We can arrange travel." Lily's first instinct was to say no. Her second instinct was to hang up. Her third was the one that always showed up. When she was scared, curiosity, the need to know what her mother had carried alone. "Why now?" Lily asked. A pause. "Because he is not well," the lawyer said. "And because certain matters cannot be delayed any longer." The call ended and Lily stood behind the counter feeling like her body was still in the cafe, but her mind had already boarded a plane. She wiped the same clean spot of counter twice, then 3 times, because her hands needed something to do. That night she sat on her bed with her mother's old scarf in her lap, the one that still smelled faintly like lavender. She tried to picture a man rich enough to be called the richest in a city she'd only visited once on a school trip. She tried to picture him looking at her baby photos, seeing his own face, and choosing to reach out. Then the fear found its voice. What if he isn't kind? What if he wants something? What if this is a joke? But the next day the ticket arrived. Real. Confirmed. Paid. Lily stared at it for a long time. Then she packed a small bag like she was going to work a double shift. Not meet a stranger who might rewrite her entire life. On the flight, her hands shook every time the plane dipped. Not from turbulence. From the thought that her mother had died with this secret still locked inside her. When she landed, a driver held a sign with her name. The city outside the window was taller and louder than her town. Glass buildings. Horns. People walking fast like time was chasing them. They drove out of the center and onto a long, tree-lined road that made the world go quiet again. Then, the gates appeared. The mansion looked like something built to impress a person who never felt impressed. White stone, tall windows, a garden too perfect to be real. Lily stepped out and felt small in a way she hadn't felt since her mom's funeral, like she was entering a place where her voice would echo and then disappear. The door opened before she could knock. A woman stood there, beautiful in a way that made Lily instantly aware of her own plain shoes and simple dress. Dark, glossy hair. Perfect skin. An expensive outfit that fit like it had been tailored around her confidence, but her eyes were cold. "You must be Lily," the woman said. "Yes," Lily replied, forcing her voice steady. "I'm Victoria Sterling," the woman said. "Robert's wife." The word wife landed like a stamp. This wasn't a story where Lily would be welcomed into a warm family. This was a story where she was an interruption. Victoria stepped aside without inviting her. Lily followed into a foyer. That smelled like polished wood and money. No photos on the walls, Lily noticed. No signs of laughter. Just space. Expensive, quiet space. "You'll be staying in the East Wing," Victoria said. "Dinner is at 7. It wasn't a welcome. It was instructions. At dinner, the table was long enough to make Lily feel like she was sitting at the edge of her own life. Robert Sterling arrived late, supported by a cane and a careful kind of pride. He looked older than Lily expected. His face was sharp, his eyes tired. When he looked at Lily, something flickered there, quick and painful. "Lily," he said softly, as if saying it made him both guilty and relieved. She wanted to say, "Dad." She couldn't. The words stuck behind everything her mother never explained. Across from her sat Ethan, Victoria's son. Lily could tell immediately he wasn't like his mother. He kept his shoulders slightly hunched, like he'd learned to take up less space. He barely spoke, only nodded when spoken to, eyes down on his plate. Then, another chair scraped. A young man took a seat beside Ethan, relaxed in a way that didn't match the stiffness of the room. Dark hair, bright eyes, a face that looked honest even before he smiled. Daniel, Ethan said quietly, introducing him. Daniel's gaze moved across the table and found Lily. It wasn't the same look Victoria gave her. It held no judgment, just interest. Hi, Daniel said. Hi, Lily answered, surprised by how good it felt to be seen like a person. Dinner stayed polite and heavy, but Daniel talked enough to soften the air. He asked Lily about her town, her work, what she liked to do when she wasn't making coffee for half the county. Lily found herself answering, laughing once, then twice. It felt like warmth had entered the room through a crack. That night, in a bedroom bigger than her apartment, Lily lay awake thinking about Daniel's smile, and about the quiet sadness in her father's eyes when he thought no one was watching. The next day, Victoria asked Lily to come to her room. It was immaculate, nothing out of place. Even the flowers looked like they'd been instructed where to stand. Victoria sat like a queen waiting for tribute. You're here for money, Victoria said. Lily's stomach tightened. No, I'm here because I didn't know my father existed. Victoria slid a document across the table. Sign this. Lily looked down. Words she didn't fully understand. Legal phrases that made her throat dry. But the meaning was clear enough. She would renounce any claim to the sterling fortune. She would accept that she had no right here. Lily felt the old instinct rise, the one she'd used her whole life after her mom died. Don't make trouble, keep it simple, walk away. That instinct had kept her safe. It had also kept her small. She thought of her mother working 2 jobs and still finding time to pack Lily's lunches with little notes that said, "You can do hard things." Lily's hands shook, but she didn't reach for the pen. "I can't sign this," she said. Victoria's eyes hardened. "You will know," Lily repeated, quieter but firmer. "I won't." Something changed in Victoria's face. Not just anger, calculation, like Lily, had revealed herself as a problem that would need solving. Lily left the room feeling cold all the way to her bones. She walked the garden paths until the manicured flowers blurred. Then she found Daniel, by the fountain, as if the house had placed him there on purpose. "You look like you're carrying a storm," Daniel said. Lily almost lied, almost said she was fine. That was her flaw too, protecting people from her truth. But she told him instead, not everything, just enough. Daniel listened like it mattered. Over the next week, Daniel was around often. He and Lily walked the garden. He told her stories about the city, about Ethan's childhood, about how Robert Sterling had built an empire and somehow still looked lonely inside it. Lily began to feel something she hadn't expected to feel in that house. Hope. Then one evening she went to the library to be alone. The room smelled like old paper and silence. A lamp glowed over a large wooden table. Daniel stood there, holding something, a letter. Lily froze because she knew that handwriting. She had seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the last note her mother left on the kitchen table before she went to the hospital and never came back. "Daniel," Lily whispered. "That's from my mother." Daniel turned fast. His face went pale. His hand tightened around the envelope like it could hide the truth. For a second, he looked like a boy caught stealing. "I can explain," he said. Lily's heart beat hard. "Why do you have it?" He swallowed. "Victoria asked me to. She paid me." The room tilted. "She paid you to what?" Lily asked, her voice thin. "To watch you," Daniel admitted. "To listen. To report what you said, where you went, whether you were trying to, I don't know, take something." Lily took a step back, like the air itself had betrayed her. Every laugh in the garden replayed in her mind, suddenly sharp. Every kind look, every moment she'd begun to trust. "You were spying on me," she said. Daniel's eyes looked wet. "At first, yes, I needed the money. Ethan asked me to help with some debts, and Victoria offered. I thought it was harmless. Harmless." The word felt cruel. "In my mother's letter," Lily said, voice shaking. "You were going through her things too." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "Victoria gave it to me. She wanted to know what Mary wrote. She wanted leverage. Lily's chest hurt. Her mother had been dead for years, and still this house was trying to use her. You let her, Lily said. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't defend himself. That was worse. Lily left the library without another word. She went to her room, shoved clothes into her bag, and stared at herself in the mirror. Her eyes looked older than yesterday. Her mistake became clear in that moment. She had wanted warmth so badly, she had ignored the obvious cold. She had trusted too quickly because she was tired of being alone. Before sunrise, she slipped out of the mansion, past gates that didn't even squeak, like the house had been built to swallow people quietly. She took a train back to her town and returned to the only life that still felt real. The coffee shop smelled like cinnamon and familiarity. Her boss hugged her like no question needed answering. Lily tied on her apron and tried to pretend the mansion had been a fever dream. But on the second day, she saw Daniel outside the shop, standing by the old tree across the street. He didn't come in, he just waited. He waited the next day too, and the next. Finally, Lily walked out after her shift, heart thudding. Why are you here? She asked. Daniel looked exhausted. Because I was wrong. Lily crossed her arms. That's not an answer. I took money to spy on you, he said. I hated myself for it. And then I started to care about you, and I didn't know how to get out without making it worse. Lily's voice went quiet. So you kept doing it? Yes, he admitted. And that's on me. The honesty surprised her. Not because it excused him, because it was rare. I fell in love with you, Daniel said, eyes steady now. Not with your father's money, not with that house, with you. The girl who still looks people in the eye even when she's scared. Lily almost laughed, bitter. You don't get to say that like it fixes things. I know, he said. I just needed you to hear it. I quit. I told Victoria no. That's why I'm here. Lily didn't answer. She went inside and closed the door and tried not to cry in front of customers. Some part of her wanted to believe him. Another part wanted to protect herself with stone. 2 weeks later, the lawyer called again. Mr. Sterling's condition has worsened, he said. There will be a reading of the will. Lily returned to the mansion because she didn't want her last moment with her father to be avoidance. If there was one thing she'd learned in that whirlwind, it was that running from pain didn't stop pain. It just delayed it. The house felt colder than before. Victoria waited in black, eyes sharp. Ethan sat with his hands folded, jaw tight. Daniel stood near the wall, tense, as if he didn't know where he was allowed to exist. The lawyer sat at the long table and began to read. Robert Sterling's voice lived only in paper now. His businesses, his assets, the house, the accounts. The future he had built without Lily, and then tried to stitch her into at the end. Then the lawyer said her name. Lily, everything, all of it. Left to her, the room went silent like the air had been cut. Victoria erupted, no. This is impossible. The lawyer stayed calm. It is clear and valid. Ethan's eyes widened. He looked at Lily like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as an intruder, but as a force. Daniel looked stunned too, and Lily felt the shock move through her body in waves. She hadn't come for money. She hadn't asked for this, yet the world had placed it in her lap like a test. In that moment, Lily understood her father's final message. Not love expressed with hugs. Not time he couldn't give back. But a choice. A chance for her to never be small again. Victoria's anger turned sharp. You'll ruin everything, she hissed. Lily looked at the woman who had tried to erase her with a signature, and felt something steady rise. I won't ruin it, Lily said. I'll stop it from ruining me. After the will, Lily sat alone in a room full of wealth, and felt strangely empty. Money didn't soften grief. It didn't explain why her mother carried the secret. It didn't fix the fact that her father waited too long. So Lily made her own decision. She ensured Victoria would not be left helpless. She allocated a generous settlement, enough for comfort and dignity, but not enough to control Lily's life. She did the same for Ethan, who had never been cruel, only trapped in a house that taught him to stay quiet. Then Lily sold the mansion. Not out of revenge, out of honesty. It was beautiful, but it was not her home. It was a monument to coldness. She sold most of the companies too, keeping only what she needed to build something clean. When the dust settled, Lily returned to what had always felt real. Small places, simple work, people who looked you in the eye. Daniel came to her town again, this time not waiting in shadows, but standing in the cafe line like everyone else. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to watch what I do." Next, Lily didn't forgive him in a single moment. She made him earn it. Weeks of patience, months of consistency, a steady presence that didn't demand she'll heal on his schedule. Slowly, trust returned like sunlight after a long winter. One evening, Daniel looked at her across the counter as she wiped down a table and said, "You could have become like them, but you chose you." Lily felt tears rise and didn't hide them. Later, in a small park in their town, Daniel asked her to marry him. No cameras, no grand stage, just a simple ring and a question that sounded like a promise. Lily said yes, not because she needed saving, but because she wanted partnership. They opened a little shop together, a place that smelled like coffee and fresh bread, a place where nobody had to beg to be treated like family. And sometimes, when Lily locked up at night, she thought about her mother, about the secrets, about the pain, about the love that had carried her even when it was imperfect. Lily didn't get a fairy tale. She got something better. She got her own life, built by her own hands. And this time, nobody could make her sign herself away.